Matt Pearl. I was a broadcast journalist, a TV news reporter, locally and nationally for 20 years. Now I run Pearl Impact Media. I help nonprofits and purpose-driven businesses raise money, raise awareness, and distinguish themselves from the rest through meaningful, memorable, and affordable video storytelling. That is my mission, and an offshoot of that mission is this podcast. Each episode, I chat with a nonprofit leader with a defined, thoughtful, and successful approach to telling their organization's story. Episode 5 is where we are, and as you may know, I often find myself on the wonderful, excruciating platform called LinkedIn. I post a lot, I read a lot, and every now and then, a post pops up in my feed that greatly fires me up. That happened a few weeks back. I read about a Climate Storytellers Summit bringing in fascinating storytellers doing critical storytelling on maybe the most critical issue of our lives. The summit brought in so many voices, it's now available for viewing online, and one of the leaders behind it is today's guest. She is the co-founder of the University of Pennsylvania's program in Environmental Humanities. She is also the founder of Penn's My Climate Story initiative. Bethany Wiggin, welcome to .org.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Happy to have you, and the first question we ask is always the toughest. Tell us about your organization in 30 seconds or less. Now, you have your hands in many things, so we'll specifically talk about My Climate Story. Tell us about My Climate Story in 30 seconds or less.
Sure. My Climate Story is an educational project, really. We're not a nonprofit. Maybe we'll become one. That would be great. But right now, it's an educational effort to support climate literacy, expand climate literacy by helping participants in workshops and classrooms understand, one, that they have a climate story, and two, that it's worth sharing with others.
Beautiful. You did it. 30 seconds. Beautiful. Now, obviously, you've done a lot in your career. You have a very storied career, and you've done quite a bit just at the University of Pennsylvania alone. What was the genesis of this idea, and when did it happen?
Yeah, the Climate Storytellers Summit really grew out of my interest in thinking about how my project or our project, it's also been built by a lot of collaborators, how this climate storytelling project could come into conversation with climate communicators. And climate communicators are often more pragmatic, more in the vein of science communications, like give me the science, digest it, communicate it to public audiences. Climate communicators are really based and rooted in that field. Climate storytellers, I would say, are more creative. I think of them as being more creative. They're often like experimental artists, sometimes even musicians. And the work that I've been doing is really lying at the intersection of both like pragmatic communications and creative arts-driven communications. And I didn't see very many places where these two kind of both of themselves very intersectional fields, but where they were really intentionally coming together. I've been building this public climate storytelling curriculum for students and teachers for a long time now. And I thought, hey, let's get a whole bunch of super talented people together, build resources, and continue to build those into a shared curriculum that really brings the science of climate, the science of science communications, or the social science of communications, also together with creative approaches to storytelling and climate literacy. So I called up good folks, really leaders in the field of climate communications, the folks at Yale's program in climate change communication, or YPCCC. And I knew their work through my own like investigations and learning about climate communications and best practices. And their public partnerships director, Joshua Lowe, was immediately game and just said, yeah, let's do some. Let's see what we can do. This is a really cool idea. And I think we'll have a lot of interest. And I, this past year, have been a visiting professor at Princeton University's High Meadows Environmental Institute, and the folks at Princeton were just also super game. And so together with my home institution at the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton and Yale, we all kind of got together, shared resources, and I hope really provided a great model of what cross-institutional cooperation can do to really build and support these intersectional communications, public engagement, and climate activism, really, in a time where it's more necessary than ever.
Yeah. And it all added up to nearly 2 hours of presentations on storytelling initiatives going on worldwide. Um, I know what struck me was the sheer diversity of forms of storytelling, not just the diversity of the storytellers and where they were located and their histories, but just the types of storytelling. And I think that's a lesson, obviously our audience here is nonprofits across the board, not just climate nonprofits, right? And I think a lot of nonprofits view storytelling in a specific silo, but I think what shows on your recording, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that you can tell stories about the same issue in different ways from different perspectives and maybe to different audiences as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so when YPCCC and High Meadows, and when we put out this call for applications, we didn't really know what we were going to get, but in terms of responses. But one thing we knew, even ahead of like vetting what our submissions, was that we had a real sense that there was a real diversity of climate storytelling practices going on, and we really wanted to highlight the ways that very local and community specific, community grounded groups were engaging with their own communities, surfacing stories, helping to document local stories of global climate change, and then documenting those stories, if you will, in very culturally specific ways. So we had such a range of storytellers. Some included groups who were using indigenous puppetry traditions from Southeast Asia. We had North American park rangers who were really keyed into the kind of acoustic guitar, like alt country kind of vibe. There was a real range. Of course, there were engaged like Instagram influencers who were really amazing, like global voices, but still very rooted in their own local communities, in Delhi, in India, for example, or a group who's doing amazing work to train indigenous activists across the South America to be voices on the global stage, really, even at like IP, at COP meetings, to really represent their local communities in these very global places. So we felt like what we really wanted to bring home is that although climate change is global, because it is human made, it also has human impacts. And those human impacts are deeply rooted in local histories and cultures. And those were the stories that we really wanted to bring forward.
I think there's a really interesting conversation about how you reach certain audiences about this topic. I remember back as a local news reporter, when I was with the NBC affiliate in Atlanta, I did a 30-minute documentary about climate solutions in Georgia. And we were very careful when we put it together about staying out of the shouting match and really just telling stories of people, data, experiences, and letting those lead the way. And then similarly, when I worked for Scripps as a national correspondent, it was really the same approach because our audience had such a wide range of views that you really you didn't want to put anything out that could get caught up and dissected in a way that, wasn't productive. So really it came down to kind of like what you're talking about, making things human centered. If you're going to make any assertions, make sure you're backing it up with data. Um, and then just kind of move forward with the understanding of who your audience is and what their preconceptions might be about the climate and how it is changing. I'm curious what your takeaways were from the various storytellers who spoke at the summit.
Well, one of the things that I really took away from it is that as much as it's important there are best practices in storytelling, I think, and climate storytelling in particular. And one, of course, is like it has to be science driven, science backed, right? And certainly like overstating things is not worthwhile, right? and it's counterproductive to sort of to try to do that. But I think what we also saw very much like live and up close is that as much as we might market test or poll test or like message test certain things, that actual creative, like artist driven approaches are just so effective. And sometimes you don't know why, but it's the passion of the artist. It's the creativity involved. It's the heart. It's the beauty, whether of images that are presented, of poetic language that's presented, of experimental theater like modes that are tried out, or music, and that there isn't one best approach. Like there isn't a story of, one size fits all. It absolutely is not that way. What and I think that that is in some ways kind of unsurprising because the way that climate change is impacting various communities is very different. And it will come to mean different things. It has different impacts in different communities' lives. And for that reason, finding the story, the forms, and the voices, the faces that really can bring local stories home. There is many as we are. There just is no single best practice. So I think like we need a diversity of stories, and that diversity of stories actually helps to really drive home this message that climate change impacts us all, of course, in very different and uneven kinds of ways.
She is Bethany Wiggin. I am Matt Pearl. This is .org, the podcast about how nonprofits tell their stories. Let me take 30 seconds to tell you about how I tell stories. I was a journalist for many years. I traveled the world, covered the Olympics 3 times, won national awards for video journalism, mostly for stories about the underreported issues facing our communities and the people and organizations offering solutions. Now I get to work directly with those people and organizations. At Pearl Impact Media, I provide meaningful, memorable video storytelling for nonprofits and purpose-driven businesses. Maybe you want to raise funds, maybe you want to raise awareness, maybe you want to showcase your services in ways only video can do. I'm based in Atlanta but work with clients across the country, and I would love to work with you. Head to my website at pearlimpactmedia.com to schedule a free consultation. Back with Bethany Wiggin, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the founder of My Climate Story. We've talked a lot about the summit. Let's talk about My Climate Story and your goals with that, how the summit fit into that, and what that looks like for the years to come.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I love to talk about my climate story, both my own as well as the project. And in fact, this project in very real ways grew out of my own climate story. I, as you said, I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, but I've lived for a long time. I grew up in the state of Maine, and I go back there every summer. About 6 years ago, I was walking around our family house there and noticed that trees that had been very healthy just the year before were gray. They're along the ocean, and that gray, dying evergreen tree was really an obvious sign of saltwater intrusion, likely from increased storm surges and rising sea levels. And although I'm an educator who teaches all the time about climate change, when this happened to me, it had a very different impact. I spent the rest of that summer really grieving and feeling really sad. Like I hadn't realized it was coming so fast, that it was in my own, literally in my own yard.
Yeah.
And I started thinking, how could I have been so naive? And how might this insight into my own kind of naivete and the fact that climate impacts were accelerating before my eyes, how could I design educational curriculum that made use of this emotional impact? And so I thought, let me try out with some students personal narratives. What would our climate stories be? Not just mine, but all individuals who are participating. And I was really lucky that I got to work with fabulous student interns. Actually, during pandemic, we met online once a week. We offered workshops. We eventually created a My Climate Story documentary and a workbook, which allows people to do those workshops on their own. And we designed this workshop in the documentary in order to recruit high school teachers to work with us the following year. We worked with 9 Philadelphia high school teachers, each of whom used our curriculum to create each Philadelphia climate classrooms. We partnered with our local NPR affiliate, WHYY, here in Philadelphia. Together, we produced a climate storytelling festival, the Philadelphia Climate Story. We built more curriculum, we shared curriculum. And then college students were like, well, what about us? Like, that's so great that you're doing this with high schoolers. So then we created a program called Campus Correspondence, where Penn student interns trained student interns at 12 universities across North America,
Wow.
ranging from British Columbia to Puerto Rico. And we trained those students to fan out across their campus and interview campus people, students, faculty, staff about their local climate stories. So we heard stories from Arizona and Wisconsin, from Cornell and Ithaca to Boston and beyond. And what we realized was that people were really hungry to talk about their climate stories, to not feel alone with this sense of like, wow, this is all happening and nobody's talking about it. I'm like having my education just like the world was, 1990. And we're living in a quantitatively and qualitatively different world. So, talking about these climate stories on college campuses has become a way of really building community, but also building curriculum that educates people about local climate impacts, about how it's changing their lives, and gives them a platform to also articulate positive visions for what they would like their climate to be. So and just this last step, like directly leading up to the summit that we've been talking about, is that I got the great chance, thanks to Princeton University, to be with them for a whole year this past year. And one of the main things I did was pilot more curriculum together with Princeton students. And we devised together new workshops that also surface and help to publish new forms of climate stories. And together with the Princeton students, I'll just show this super. We made a magazine, and it is our hope that this magazine, the very first one in the My Climate Story suite of projects, that it will be a prototype that others can use at other college campuses. It certainly could also be used at high schools as well. We had hoped to apply for a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to support this project. Alas, that is not going to happen now, but we had so many preparatory conversations about it. There's so many people who are interested, and I think we'll get it done. But really, if anyone is listening to this who's on a college or university campus who wants to get involved, please be in touch, because we're really excited to collect and publish students' stories, share them with one another, and make them a learning resource for college students and teachers more widely, to really think about and to learn from how climate change is being experienced across campuses.
I mean, it's just so fascinating to hear about the breadth and the multidimensional way that you're approaching this and the way you're getting your students engaged and involved. And it's interesting because typically, I interview nonprofit leaders who are very much working at the professional level, and their audience are often adults, right? Whether it's donors or potential clients or potential donors. You work largely with students, and I would love to get your sense on how they view storytelling and how they have, or maybe how your view of storytelling has evolved based on your interactions with them.
Oh, yeah, that's such a great question. So I'll say one thing, which is that, I'm 53 years old. I didn't grow up in a born digital kind of way, but my students certainly have. And I think that makes them intuitively, they understand digital storytelling in a way that is much more sophisticated than mine,
Sure.
which means that I've learned a ton from them. So I really learn as much from my students as they do from me. Different things, I think. One of the things that I've learned is just to continuously document everything and push it out on social media as quickly as possible. We tell stories about the longer form, like we create longer form, more sophisticated stories, but we are documenting how we're telling those stories along the way. So, while I really like slow forms that have to do with writing and reflection and design workshops to do that, my students tend to like quicker video driven Instagram like or TikToks. And we've realized that there's really room for both and there's need for both, I think. Much more, there are a need to reach audiences, particularly youth audiences, through places where they're looking already, particularly social. But then there's also a need to do kind of slower, more reflective work that gives students who want to become more engaged the opportunity to really delve into some of the research on not only climate science, but also climate communications, and to have the opportunity to develop their own voices and concerns as storytellers, so that they really feel enabled, empowered, and really well grounded in the research in order to really like advance their own voices.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great lesson for the nonprofits out there. I've worked with quite a few climate nonprofits, and I've come into contact with climate nonprofits through my work as a journalist and now with Pearl Impact Media. And I can tell you that the ones who really focus on storytelling, they are everywhere. You know, you see their posts on social media, you see them kind of doing what you're doing, like doing long form projects, but then spinning them off into short form bites. You see them on all forms of social media, and it's, I think, really, really interesting, and maybe speaks to the world we're living in right now, where, I think for a lot of nonprofits, they kind of narrow their audience to a real small niche target audience. But when we're talking about the climate and the ways that you can have an impact from, you know, taking physical action to voting, I mean, they cover everyone. So you kind of have to have, uh, an all hands on deck and an all audiences welcome approach to it if you want to have the impact that's required right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And but the challenge there, of course, is that because it is such a huge story,
Yeah.
climate, it can also get lost. I mean, I think we see that, daily in the news stories that we get, because unless climate is literally burning up, terrifyingly, with wildfires, it does not make the front page. Like, right, if it doesn't burn, it gets lost. And the many climate impacts are not so dramatic. And that means that there isn't, they have a different flavor, these slower stories or these more gradual stories or these less dramatic stories, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. And I think that for that reason, some of these longer, more contemplative forms are more appropriate. There's been excellent work, at the Storyteller Summit, we had um, storytellers who were really trying to use forms often experimental that helped them to combine like dramatic impacts but also with the sort of slow creep and the sort of gradual impacts that we're also seeing, or things that are hard to name, like wacky weather. Like, is it a climate impact? We know on the whole it is, but climate attribution science has made great, great strides. But it's still in the moment, like where I'm sitting, it's raining buckets outside. We know that, Philadelphia is getting much, much wetter, but is today's rain actually due to climate? I can't say for sure right now.
Right.
And living with that uncertainty is a constant for us, but it's not a dramatic story. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, like, finding narrative forms or artistic forms that can help us talk about how we live with uncertainty, that's really tricky. Those are stories that I think aren't really very Instagrammable, but they're really wonderful for theatrical productions, for example, or even musical songs. In the summit, we heard from theater artist Jessica Crayon, who is a theater maker and also game designer who thinks about uncertainty and risk, but in very poetic forms. We also heard from musicians, the traveling park rangers, who saw quick climate changes but also slow climate changes in the forms of melting glaciers where they had been park rangers in Glacier National Park, and then thinking about the personal impacts of those. Did Gary, the traveling park ranger, still feel like it would be okay to travel, like
Mm.
fly, knowing about the emissions from long distance flights, thinking about those personal responsibilities and whether they even make any difference, like given like the scope of emissions and fossil majors' apparent indifference to climate change.
Mm.
So I think like we just need a real range of stories. The more stories, the better.
Bethany, I have really enjoyed this conversation. I'm going to ask you that famous last question that all reporters love to ask. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you would like to add?
Oh gosh, such a great question. What I want to say is something that we've touched on a couple of times, somewhat explicitly, but I want to make it really loud and clear is that really in this day and age, everyone has a climate story.
Mm.
It really behooves us all to kind of dig deep and think about what that is, to think about how climate is impacting our lives, our children's lives, our youngsters' lives, the lives of elders and more vulnerable in our communities, and then to share that story with your wider community, because we know so many people are sitting alone with their climate anxiety or their climate uncertainty, and that if we can build a sense of a shared story locally, we also, that is one of the most important ways to begin to take action on climate.
That's Bethany Wiggin, the founder of My Climate Story at the University of Pennsylvania. Bethany, you have so many different tentacles and so many different things. I was going to try to narrow it down to one website, but list them all. Where can we find you and your various initiatives?
Go straight to my-climate-story.org, and there you will find many climate storytelling resources, from the recording of the summit to actual lists of places you can go to get further tips, to My Climate Story workshops, to a story bank with student stories, and more. So thank you, Matt, so much for this conversation, and I hope your listeners will be in touch.
Thanks so much, Bethany. Great to speak with you. And that is episode 5 of .org. If you found this helpful and want others to hear it too, a great rating or review wherever you get your podcasts goes a long way. Please take the time if you can, and check out my work at Pearl Impact Media. Video storytelling can be so beneficial for organizations. I would love to work with yours. Book a free consultation at pearlimpactmedia.com. All right, friends, I am Matt Pearl. Thank you for listening to .org. We'll see you next time.